In March of the year 2000, in a remote corner of southwestern Uganda, more than 500 people burned to death inside a locked church. The windows had been boarded shut, the doors were nailed from the outside. Gasoline had been poured throughout the building. Most of the victims were members of a doomsday cult called the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. They had been told the world would end. They had been told the Virgin Mary would save them. Instead, they died in flames, their screams unheard beyond the wooden walls. But here's what keeps investigators awake at night. Among the charred remains, among the bodies piled 3 and 4 deep, among the children and elderly who never had a chance to escape, one body was never conclusively identified. The body of Joseph Kibweteere, the cult's founder, the man who orchestrated this nightmare, the man who convinced hundreds of people to sell their possessions, abandon their families, and prepare for the end of the world. Was he among the dead? Or did he escape before the flames consumed his followers? And if he escaped, where is he now, more than 2 decades later? This is the story of a man who spoke with angels, a man who claimed to hear the Virgin Mary herself, a man who built a kingdom on fear and faith, and then watched it burn. Or did he? Joseph Kibweteere was born in 1932 in the western region of Uganda, in a time when the country was still under British colonial rule.
He grew up in a deeply Catholic family, in the district of Mbara, where faith wasn't just practiced on Sundays, but woven into the fabric of daily life. His childhood was unremarkable in many ways. He attended local schools. He learned the catechism. He sang hymns in a small church with a tin roof and dirt floors. But even then, those who knew him said there was something different about Joseph. He wasn't just religious, he was obsessed. As a young man, Kibweteere pursued education with the same fervor he applied to his faith. He became a teacher, a respected position in a region where literacy was still a privilege. He married a woman named Teresa, and together they had children. By all accounts, he was a devoted father. He attended Mass regularly.
He was known in his community as a pious man, someone who took his Catholic faith seriously. Perhaps too seriously for some. But nothing in those early years suggested the darkness that would later consume him. Kibweteere taught at a Catholic school, and his students remember him as strict but fair. A man who believed discipline and devotion were inseparable. He would quote scripture from memory. He would lead prayers before class. He seemed to genuinely believe that education was a form of salvation, that knowledge could bring people closer to God. But over time, something began to shift. His sermons became longer. His interpretations became stranger. He started to question the church itself. By the 1980s, Kibweteere had become disillusioned with the Catholic Church. He believed it had strayed from its original teachings. He believed priests had become corrupt, that they cared more about money and power than salvation. He wasn't alone in these feelings. Across Uganda, a growing number of Catholics were frustrated with what they saw as the Church's failure to address moral decay, political violence, and social instability. Uganda had been through hell. Idi Amin's brutal dictatorship had ended in 1979, but the country remained fractured. Civil war raged in the north. Poverty was widespread. People were desperate for answers, for hope, for someone to tell them that suffering had meaning. Kibweteere saw an opportunity. Or perhaps he saw a calling. It's difficult to say where genuine belief ends and manipulation begins, but by the mid-1980s, Joseph Kibweteere had begun to hear voices. Or so he claimed. The Virgin Mary, he said, was speaking to him. She was delivering messages, warnings, prophecies. The world, she told him, was hurtling toward destruction. Humanity had abandoned God's commandments. The end was near, and only those who listened, only those who repented and followed the true path, would be saved. At first, his claims were met with skepticism. But Kibweteere was charismatic. He spoke with conviction. He could quote the Bible for hours without notes. He could weave scripture into narratives that felt urgent and personal. And in a country torn apart by violence and uncertainty, his message found fertile ground. To understand how the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God came to exist, you have to understand Uganda in the late 20th century. This wasn't just a country recovering from dictatorship. It was a place where trauma had seeped into the soil itself. Entire villages had been wiped out during Amin's reign of terror. Families had been torn apart. Trust in institutions, in government, in the church, had eroded. By the time Kibweteere began preaching his apocalyptic visions, Uganda was still reeling. President Yoweri Museveni had taken power in 1986, promising stability, but peace was fragile. In the north, the Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kibweteere, was terrorizing communities, abducting children, and committing atrocities in the name of religion. In the southwest, where Kibweteere lived, people were exhausted. They had survived one nightmare and feared another was coming. Into this environment came a message of absolute certainty. Kibweteere didn't offer vague hope, he offered a roadmap. Follow the 10 Commandments, he said, reject the modern world, purify yourselves, prepare for the end. And the Virgin Mary herself would intercede on your behalf. It's easy to dismiss his followers as naive or gullible, but that misses the point. These were people who had watched their country collapse, they had buried their children, they had seen things that defied comprehension, and now here was a man who said there was meaning in the chaos. That suffering was a test, that salvation was possible. Kibweteere wasn't working alone.
In 1989, he met a woman named Credonia Murende, and their partnership would prove catastrophic. Credonia was younger than Kibweteere, but no less devout. She came from a Catholic family in the district of Kanungu, and like Kibweteere, she claimed to receive visions from the Virgin Mary. Some who knew her described her as intense, even frightening. She rarely smiled. She spoke in a flat, mechanical tone, as if reciting something she had memorized. She claimed that Mary spoke through her, that she was merely a vessel for divine messages. And when Kibweteere met her, he believed it. Together, they formed the core of what would become the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. They began holding meetings in Credonia's home in Kanungu. They recruited followers. They developed a theology that blended Catholicism with apocalyptic prophecy. They established strict rules. Members were forbidden to speak unless absolutely necessary, because idle talk was sinful. They were forbidden to have sex, even married couples, because the end was too near to waste time on earthly pleasures. They were required to fast regularly, sometimes for days at a time. And they were required to give everything they owned to the movement. This last rule was critical. New members had to sell their land, their homes, their possessions, and donate the proceeds to the cult. In return, they were promised salvation. They were promised that when the world ended, they would be among the chosen. They would ascend to heaven. They would be spared the horrors that awaited the rest of humanity. And people believed. Entire families joined. They uprooted their lives. They abandoned their friends and relatives who refused to follow. They moved to compounds controlled by Kibweteere and Murende, where they lived in cramped conditions, worked long hours, and prepared for the apocalypse. By the mid-1990s, the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God had grown into a significant organization. They had established several compounds across southwestern Uganda, the largest of which was in Kanungu. They had hundreds of members, possibly more than 1,000 at their peak. They had attracted attention from the Catholic Church, which officially condemned them as heretics. They had attracted attention from the Ugandan government, which monitored them but took no action to shut them down. On the surface, the compounds looked almost utopian. Members grew their own food. Children attended makeshift schools. There were communal meals, communal prayers, communal work. But beneath the surface, control was absolute. Kibweteere and Murende made every decision. They decided who ate and when. They decided who could speak and to whom. They decided who could leave, and more often than not, the answer was no. Former members who managed to escape described a culture of fear. Punishments for breaking rules were severe. People were beaten. They were locked in rooms for days without food. Children were separated from their parents as a form of discipline. And always, there was the message: the end is coming. Repent, obey, or be damned. Kibweteere and Murende set dates for the apocalypse. The first was supposed to happen in the year 1992. Members prepared. They fasted. They prayed. They said goodbye to the world. And then the date came and went. Nothing happened. The sun rose. The earth continued to spin. But instead of losing faith, the followers doubled down. The leaders explained that their calculations had been slightly off. Mary had granted humanity more time to repent. The new date would be revealed soon.
This pattern repeated itself throughout the 1990s. Dates were set, dates were missed, excuses were made, and somehow, the faith of the followers never wavered.
Or perhaps it did, and those who wavered were silenced before they could spread doubt. By 1999, the movement was fracturing. Some members were beginning to question the prophecies. Some were demanding the return of the money and property they had donated. Some were trying to leave. And Kibweteere and Mwerinde knew they were losing control. They set one final date, December 31st, 1999. The world would end with the new millennium. This time, they said, there was no room for error. This time, the Virgin Mary had been explicit. Prepare yourselves. The end is here. The final months of 1999 were marked by increasing paranoia and isolation within the movement. Kibweteere and Mwerinde tightened their grip. Communication with the outside world was forbidden. Visitors were turned away. Even family members who came looking for loved ones were met with silence or hostility. Inside the compounds, members were told to fast more rigorously. Some were eating only once every few days. Children were growing weak and pale. But still, the leaders insisted. Suffering now meant salvation later. As the year drew to a close, the movement prepared for the end. They slaughtered their livestock. They stopped planting crops. They stopped maintaining their buildings. There was no point in planning for a future that wouldn't exist. On New Year's Eve, members gathered in the main compound in Kanungu. They sang hymns. They prayed. They waited for the sky to open, for the earth to crack, for the hand of God to reach down and lift them up. Midnight came. The fireworks that could be heard in distant towns marked the arrival of the year 2000. And once again, nothing happened. But this time, the silence was different. This time, the followers didn't just accept another excuse. This time, some of them spoke up. They demanded answers. They demanded their money back. They demanded to leave. And Kibweteere and Mwerinde realized they had a problem. A problem that wouldn't be solved with another postponement. A problem that threatened to destroy everything they had built. In the weeks that followed, the leaders went quiet. They held fewer meetings. They avoided direct contact with members. Behind closed doors, they were planning something. Or at least, that's what investigators believe. Because what happened next was not spontaneous. It was not an act of mass hysteria or collective delusion. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And it was designed to leave no witnesses. On March 17, 2000, members of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God were told to gather in the church at the Kanungu compound for a special celebration. The Virgin Mary, they were told, had delivered a new message. The world had not ended on December 31st, because humanity needed one more chance to repent. But now the time had truly come. Those who gathered in the church would be taken directly to heaven. They would bypass death. They would ascend in glory. The members believed. Or perhaps they didn't. But by that point, they had nowhere else to go. Their homes were gone. Their money was gone. Their families had disowned them. They had bet everything on this movement, and they couldn't afford to lose.
So they came. Hundreds of them, men, women, children, infants. They filed into the small church, a wooden structure with a corrugated iron roof. They wore their best clothes. They sang, they prayed, and then the doors were sealed. What happened inside that church will never be fully known. The few details investigators have been able to piece together come from the physical evidence left behind. The windows had been boarded up from the outside, using nails and wooden planks. The doors had been nailed shut, also from the outside. Gasoline had been poured throughout the interior, soaking the wooden benches, the floor, the walls. And then, at some point, a fire was started.
It spread quickly. Wood, fabric, human bodies, all highly flammable. The heat would have been unbearable within seconds. The smoke would have been thick and toxic. People would have panicked, tried to escape, clawed at the doors and windows. But there was no way out. The nails held, the boards held, and the fire consumed everything. When authorities arrived the next day, after neighbors reported seeing smoke and smelling burning flesh, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The roof had collapsed. The walls were still standing, but barely. Inside, the bodies were piled on top of each other, carbonized beyond recognition. Investigators counted over 500 victims. Some estimates put the number closer to 600. Many were children, but the church was just the beginning. In the days that followed, police discovered more bodies. At another compound owned by the movement, they found dozens of bodies buried in a latrine. At another site, they found bodies buried under a house. At yet another location, bodies were found in shallow graves, some showing signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma. The victims hadn't just died in the fire. Some had been murdered weeks or even months earlier. The total death toll remains uncertain. Official estimates range from 778 to over 1,000. Many of the bodies were so badly decomposed or burned that they couldn't be identified. Entire families have been wiped out, leaving no one to report them missing. The true number may never be known. In the immediate aftermath, the Ugandan government launched an investigation. They wanted answers.
They wanted to know how this had happened. How had a doomsday cult been allowed to operate for over a decade? How had hundreds of people been murdered without anyone intervening? And most importantly, who was responsible? The obvious suspects were Kibweteere and Morinde, but there was a problem. Neither of them could be found. In the ruins of the church, investigators tried to identify the bodies. They used dental records, DNA when possible, and descriptions from surviving family members. They identified dozens of victims. But Joseph Kibweteere was not among them. At least, not definitively. There were several bodies that could have been him, based on age and build, but none could be confirmed. And Credonia Morinde, no trace of her either.
The Ugandan police issued warrants for their arrest. Interpol added them to their most wanted list. Investigators searched the countryside, raided homes, questioned anyone who might have had contact with the cult. But Kibweteere and Morinde had vanished. Theories began to circulate almost immediately. Some believed they had died in the fire, and the bodies simply hadn't been identified due to the extent of the damage. Others believed they had escaped, either before the fire was set or in the chaos that followed. Some believed they had been murdered by their own followers, angry at the failed prophecies, and some believed they were still alive, hiding somewhere, possibly in a neighboring country.
The investigation revealed disturbing details about the days and weeks leading up to the fire. Several former members came forward to say that Kibweteere and Morinde had been acting strangely in the months before March 2000. They had been selling off cult property. They had been moving large amounts of cash. They had been meeting with people outside the movement, something they had previously forbidden. It looked, in other words, like they were preparing to disappear. One witness claimed to have seen Kibweteere in the days after the fire, traveling toward the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Another claimed to have seen Morinde in Rwanda. But none of these sightings were confirmed. The trail went cold.
To understand why Kibweteere and Morinde might have orchestrated the massacre, you have to understand the pressure they were under. By early 2000, the movement was collapsing. Members were demanding refunds. Some were threatening to go to the police. The cult's finances were in chaos. Kibweteere and Morinde had spent years collecting money from followers, but much of it had been used to fund their own lifestyles. They lived relatively comfortably compared to the members, who were starving and sleeping on dirt floors. They had access to vehicles, to good food, to medical care, and they knew that if members started talking to authorities, they would be exposed not just as false prophets, but as thieves and abusers. The fire, investigators believe, was a solution to multiple problems. It eliminated the people most likely to accuse them. It destroyed evidence of financial fraud, and it allowed Kibweteere and Morinde to disappear, either by faking their own deaths or by fleeing while the world assumed they had perished. But if they escaped, where did they go? The border with the Democratic Republic of Congo is less than 50 kilometers from Kanungu. It's a porous border, easy to cross without detection, especially in the chaos of the year 2000. The DRC was embroiled in a brutal civil war, and refugee movements were constant. 2 more people crossing into the country would have gone unnoticed. From there, they could have traveled deeper into Central Africa, to countries where Ugandan authorities had little reach. Rwanda is another possibility. It shares a border with Uganda, and in 2000, it was still recovering from the genocide of 1994. Infrastructure was weak. Record-keeping was spotty. Someone with cash and determination could disappear into the countryside and never be found. Tanzania, Kenya, even Sudan have all been suggested as potential hiding places. But without confirmed sightings, without physical evidence, it's all speculation. Some investigators believe Kibweteere and Murinde didn't work alone. They believe other senior members of the cult helped plan and execute the massacre, and that those individuals might also have escaped. Several names have been mentioned over the years, people who held leadership positions within the movement and who also disappeared after March 2000. But again, no arrests have been made.
No bodies have been definitively identified. The psychological dimension of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God is as disturbing as the physical violence. How do you convince hundreds of people to give up everything and follow you into death? How do you maintain control even when your prophecies fail, again and again? Experts in cult psychology have studied the case extensively. They point to several factors that made the movement so effective at manipulating its members. First, isolation. By cutting members off from their families and communities, the cult created an environment where only one narrative existed. Doubts couldn't be reinforced by outside perspectives. Questions couldn't be validated by people who weren't part of the group. Members lived in an echo chamber, where Kibweteere and Murende's authority was absolute. Second, the use of fear. The cult's entire theology was built on the idea that the world was ending, and that only those who obeyed would be saved. This created a constant state of anxiety. Members were afraid of being left behind, afraid of eternal damnation, afraid of losing the only community they had left. Fear is a powerful motivator, and Kibweteere and Murinde wielded it expertly. Third, the exploitation of cultural and religious beliefs. Uganda is a deeply religious country, and Catholicism in particular has a strong tradition of visions, miracles, and apparitions. The idea that the Virgin Mary might speak to someone wasn't inherently absurd to people raised in that tradition.
Kibweteere and Murinde took something familiar and twisted it, using religious language and imagery to legitimize their own authority. Fourth, the sunk cost fallacy. Once members had given up their homes, their money, their relationships, leaving the cult meant admitting they had made a catastrophic mistake. It meant facing the reality that they had destroyed their lives for nothing. For many, it was psychologically easier to stay and keep believing than to leave and confront the truth. And finally, charisma. Kibweteere, by all accounts, was a compelling speaker. He could make people feel seen, understood, important. He could make them believe that their suffering had meaning. And in a country where so many people had suffered so much, that was a powerful gift. The legal aftermath of the Kanungu massacre has been frustratingly slow and incomplete. In the more than 2 decades since the fire, no one has been convicted in connection with the deaths. The Ugandan government conducted an initial investigation, but it was hampered by lack of resources, lack of expertise, and lack of political will. By 2001, the investigation had largely stalled. Part of the problem was jurisdictional. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God had operated across multiple districts, and coordinating between different police departments was difficult. Part of the problem was evidentiary. The fire had destroyed so much evidence, and the bodies buried at other sites had decomposed to the point where autopsies were nearly impossible. And part of the problem was simply that the primary suspects had disappeared. Over the years, various individuals have been questioned in connection with the case. Some were former members who managed to escape before the massacre. Some were people who had sold property to the cult or done business with Kibweteere and Murinde. But none of these leads went anywhere. Without physical evidence linking someone to the fire or the murders, prosecutors couldn't build a case. The families of the victims have been left in a state of perpetual grief and frustration. Many never received confirmation that their loved ones died in the fire. The bodies were buried in mass graves, often without being identified.
DNA testing was limited and expensive, and the government didn't have the resources to test every victim. So families were left to wonder, was their son among the dead, their daughter, their parents, or had they somehow escaped and were living somewhere, too traumatized or ashamed to come home? Some families have spent years searching for answers. They've traveled to neighboring countries, following rumors of sightings. They've hired private investigators. They've pressured the government to reopen the case. But the years have turned into decades, and the answers remain elusive. In 2014, there was a brief moment of hope. A man was arrested in Kenya who matched the description of Joseph Kibweteere.
He was elderly, spoke with a Ugandan accent, and had been living under an assumed name in a rural area. Ugandan authorities requested his extradition. But when investigators examined him more closely, they realized he wasn't Kibweteere. The man was a former teacher, like Kibweteere, but his identity was eventually confirmed through relatives who came forward. It was a case of mistaken identity, but it reignited public interest in the case and reminded people that the primary suspects had never been found. Around the same time, a woman fitting Credonia Morinde's description was reportedly seen in eastern Congo. The sighting came from a missionary who claimed to have spoken with her, though the woman denied being Morinde and fled before authorities could investigate. Again, nothing came of it. These false leads are common in cases like this. People want to believe that justice is still possible, that the guilty can still be caught. And so, every elderly Ugandan man living abroad becomes a potential suspect. Every reclusive woman becomes a possible Morinde. But so far, every lead has ended in disappointment. The truth is, if Kibweteere and Morinde are still alive, they would be in their 90s and 70s respectively by now. They could be living quietly somewhere, their true identities known only to themselves. They could be dead, having succumbed to illness or old age in some remote village where no one thought to ask questions. Or they could have died in the fire, their bodies simply unidentifiable among the hundreds of others. There's another theory that refuses to die, despite a lack of concrete evidence. Some investigators believe the Kanungu massacre was not primarily about failed prophecies or financial fraud. They believe it was about something darker. They believe Kibweteere and Morinde were running a criminal enterprise, and the cult was just a cover. This theory points to the fact that large amounts of money disappeared along with the leaders. Members had donated cash, land titles, valuables. Some estimates suggest the cult collected millions of dollars over the years. Very little of that money was found after the fire. It wasn't in bank accounts. It wasn't hidden in the compounds. It simply vanished. Could Kibweteere and Morinde have been using the cult to fund something else? There were rumors, never confirmed, that they had connections to smuggling networks operating along the Uganda-Congo border. That region has long been a hub for illegal trade in minerals, weapons, and other goods. Could the cult have been a money-laundering operation disguised as a religious movement? There's also the question of the bodies found buried before the fire. Some showed signs of having been killed weeks or even months earlier. Why? Were they members who tried to leave and were silenced? Were they people who discovered the truth about the cult's finances? Or was something even more sinister happening? Some former members claim that people who questioned the leaders simply disappeared. They would be there one day and gone the next, with explanations that they had been sent to another compound or had left to visit family. But they were never seen again. If that's true, how many people were murdered before March 2000? How long had Kibweteere and Morinde been killing to maintain their control? These are questions without answers. The evidence was destroyed or never collected in the first place. The witnesses are dead or too afraid to speak, and the people who could provide the truth are nowhere to be found. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the children. Estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 of the victims in the church fire were under the age of 18. Some were infants. Many had been born into the cult, raised with no knowledge of the outside world, taught from birth that the apocalypse was imminent and that suffering was holy. These children had no choice. They didn't decide to join the movement. They didn't sell their property or donate their savings. They were simply born to parents who believed, and they died because of that belief. And yet, in the years since the massacre, their stories have been largely forgotten. The focus has been on Kibweteere and Morinde, on the adults who made choices, on the theology and psychology of cult manipulation. But the children are the ones who deserve to be remembered most. Some survived. A handful of members managed to leave before March 2000, and they took their children with them. These survivors have spoken, occasionally, about what life was like inside the movement. They describe a world where children were taught to fear God more than they loved Him, where punishment was swift and harsh, where questions were forbidden. They describe watching their siblings grow thin from fasting, watching other children being beaten for speaking out of turn, watching the joy drain out of childhood.
And they described guilt. Guilt for surviving when so many others didn't. Guilt for not doing more to save their friends. Guilt for believing, even if only for a moment, that the leaders were telling the truth. The psychological scars left by the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God extend far beyond the victims who died.
They extend to the survivors, to the families who lost loved ones, to the communities that were torn apart. And those scars are still raw, even now. In the years since 2000, Uganda has grappled with how to prevent something like this from happening again. The government implemented new regulations for religious organizations, requiring registration and oversight. But enforcement has been inconsistent. Uganda is home to thousands of churches, mosques, and other religious groups, many of them small and operating in rural areas where government presence is minimal. Monitoring them all is impossible. There have been other cults since Kanungu, though none as deadly. In 2011, a group claiming to be the reincarnation of the 10 Commandments movement emerged in western Uganda. Police shut them down before they could gain a significant following. But the fact that they existed at all is telling. The conditions that allowed Kibweteere and Morinde to thrive, poverty, instability, desperation, those conditions still exist. Religious leaders across Uganda have also tried to address the issue. The Catholic Church, in particular, has worked to educate congregations about the dangers of false prophets and apocalyptic movements. They've emphasized the importance of staying connected to established religious institutions rather than following charismatic individuals. But again, the reach of these efforts is limited. The truth is, as long as there are people suffering, there will be others willing to exploit that suffering.
As long as there are people searching for meaning, there will be those who offer easy answers in exchange for control. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of deeper problems that no amount of regulation can fully solve. So where does that leave us? More than 2 decades after the Kanungu massacre, what do we actually know? We know that on March 17, 2000, over 500 people died in a church fire in southwestern Uganda. We know that the fire was deliberately set, that the victims were locked inside, and that they had no chance of escape. We know that many of them were members of a doomsday cult led by Joseph Kibweteere and Credonia Morinde.
We know that in the days and weeks after the fire, more bodies were discovered at other cult sites, bringing the total death toll to somewhere between 778 and over 1,000. We know that Kibweteere and Morinde disappeared and have never been found. We know that millions of dollars collected from cult members also disappeared. We know that the Ugandan government investigated but never made any arrests. We know that Interpol listed Kibweteere and Morinde as wanted fugitives, but the warrants remain unserved. We know that families are still grieving. We know that survivors are still traumatized. We know that questions remain unanswered. But here's what we don't know. We don't know if Kibweteere died in the fire or escaped. We don't know if Morinde is alive or dead.
We don't know where the money went. We don't know how many people were murdered before the fire, or why. We don't know if there were accomplices who helped the leaders escape. We don't know if justice will ever be served. And we don't know if, somewhere in Central Africa, an elderly man is living under a false name, carrying the weight of hundreds of deaths, looking over his shoulder every day and wondering if this will be the day he's finally caught. Joseph Kibweteere would be 93 years old today if he's still alive. Credonia Morinde would be in her 70s. It's possible they died years ago, succumbing to illness or violence in whatever place they fled to.
It's possible they're living in obscurity, their true identities known only to a handful of people who have chosen not to turn them in. It's possible they never escaped at all, and their bodies are among the unidentified remains buried in mass graves in Kanungu. But it's also possible that they're out there, watching, waiting, remembering what they did and living with it, or not living with it at all. Some people can commit atrocities and feel nothing. Some people can destroy hundreds of lives and sleep soundly at night. If Kibweteere and Morinde are sociopaths, if they truly believed they were doing God's work, then maybe guilt has never touched them. Maybe they see themselves as martyrs, misunderstood prophets who sacrificed everything for a truth the world refused to accept.
Or maybe, late at night, they hear the screams. Maybe they smell the smoke. Maybe they see the faces of the children who trusted them, who believed them, who died because of them.
We'll probably never know. The story of Joseph Kibweteere and the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God is not just a story about a cult. It's a story about faith and fear, about power and desperation, about the ways people can be broken and remade into something unrecognizable. It's a story about how easy it is to exploit suffering, and how difficult it is to hold the guilty accountable when they vanish into thin air. It's also a story that refuses to end. Every few years, there's a new sighting, a new rumor, a new theory. Someone claims to have seen Kibweteere in Tanzania. Someone else swears they spotted Mwirinde at a market in Congo. Investigators follow the leads, and they go nowhere. But the possibility lingers. The idea that justice might still be possible, even after all these years. And maybe that's all we have left. Not certainty, not closure, just the possibility that one day, the truth will come out. That one day, someone will talk. That one day, a body will be identified, or a fugitive will be caught. That one day, the families of the victims will finally know what happened to their loved ones. Until then, the case remains open. The warrants remain active. And Joseph Kibweteere, if he's still alive, remains one of the most wanted men in the world. A man who built a kingdom on lies. A man who convinced hundreds of people to follow him into death.
A man who might have died with them or might be living free, carrying the weight of 1,000 ghosts. Where is Joseph Kibweteere? Did he burn with his followers, or did he walk away and leave them to die? And if he's still out there, what does he think about late at night when the world is quiet and there's no one left to lie to but himself? These are the questions that haunt investigators, that haunt the families, that haunt anyone who looks closely at the charred ruins of that church in Kanungu and tries to make sense of what happened there. And these are the questions that may never be answered.